Bienvenidos a la Galería Octubre, ahora en sus 40 años. Y para final, un evento muy importante. Mike Jay, que es la cosa de esta exhibición, he's the cause of all of it. Because of this book, you see, ideas are so important. And there's history and ideas in this book. And that's what got started this exhibition. Gerard Houghton, our great English advisor, writer, also historian. So we're seeing two wizards at work.
Thank you. Thanks, Jill. Well, I want today to pull many things out of Mike, as many things as possible out of Mike's word hoard and knowledge hoard. But we want to talk about the Huichol as a culture, India and the Native American Indians as cultures. I want to talk about cultures, and maybe even the Western culture if we get there by the end. But I thought, since we're talking about the Huichol culture itself, the Huichol culture takes all these rituals that we're going to be talking about and not participating in today, begin with ceremonies. And in that world, the fire, the smoke, the group, the ancestral links, the deer, all these different symbols, all these cultural artifacts come together and we celebrate them together. It's a sacred space. It's a sacred space. And right at the end, if we have time, Mike, we're going to traverse thousands of years of history. If we can get to it, I want to talk about what's happening today. But I want to begin with what we have over here. Is we're very fortunate in this is just to clear the space. Try and just to stop you thinking all the things you think. Okay, so this is a song which is basically calling the deer in. We clear space, we clear our minds, and we call in the deer. And the deer is the messenger between this world and the other world, between us and the gods. I think it's just interesting to begin there because the Huichol culture is really all about sound and song. And here we have a visual representation of a complete culture. It's such a complex thing in culture. We don't understand the words, but you can feel that something is going on. So Mike really is the start of this whole show, although it's the second one that Chile has produced in this series. And they were shows designed really to look at two things. They were designed to look at ancient cultural traditions that were using means, often chemical, maybe dance and music, means to change the way the mind is operating, sometimes visually too. Mescaline, ayahuasca, all the sorts of peyote, I should say, peyote, ayahuasca, ways to change the mind. And they were also ways of looking at the way the mind itself works. So both modern neuroscience and ancient traditions of interacting with the world. So this is Chile's second attempt to put together these various things. I think it works in very complex ways. But Mike was originally talking about mescaline. You've been writing about mescaline now for 20 odd years, I suppose. Just say lead us into the mescaline, the book that you were writing, and what you were trying to do, and how you were trying to set this up. Because it was out of a conversation, as Chile said, between herself and Mike, that she thought, I've got another show now I want to do.
Oh, thank you very much indeed, Jesse, and thank you, Chile, and thank you all for coming. Yes, I have been nibbling away at sort of parts of the mescaline story for a long time, and I eventually wrote a book about it. There hadn't been a book about it before. There's lots of books about LSD or ecstasy or whatever. There hadn't been a book about mescaline, I think partly because it's a story that goes through so many different worlds. You know, we think of psychedelics as starting in the 60s or the 50s, but the first sort of mescaline and experiments were in Europe and America in the 1890s, and it had reached the West from the peyote cactus, and that which Western doctors and anthropologists had first encountered among the Native American tribes of the Southwest USA in Oklahoma. So what was interesting to me about this as a story was that it opens up all these kind of different worlds of experiment in science and art and medicine and spirituality. But it also puts our Western idea of psychedelics up against a much older, non-Western tradition. Mescaline occurs in nature only in two cacti, and one of which is the San Pedro, which is a cactus that grows across the Andes, and the other is the peyote, which grows in northern Mexico and a little bit over the border in Texas. So I started to follow this story. You can follow it through archaeological traces and art. It goes back thousands of years, both in the Andes and in Mexico. In terms of written records of what's going on, the first European encounter with mescaline was in the form of the peyote cactus in Mexico during the Spanish conquest. So there's lots of descriptions now going back 500 years of this peyote and how sacred and important it was to the indigenous people of Mexico, and how they used it to see visions and used those in different ways. And it's elaborated itself into different artistic traditions up and down the Cordillera. It was in Mexico, it was banned by the Inquisition, but up in the north, in the areas where it had been used, it hung on in lots of tribal traditions, of which the most famous these days is the Huichol. And then during the late 19th century, it was adopted by the Native American tribes during their period of forced captivity in the reservations, once the Texas Railroad was there and it could be moved from Mexico up to places like Oklahoma. And there it led to new traditions of American art as well. So it was at the time when I was putting this story together, and I was looking for an image of Huichol art as a sort of plate for the plate section of the book, and I made contact with Chile because I remembered the fantastic exhibition Sacred Visions of Huichol art that had been here 20 years ago, which was the first time I really saw that kind of range of Huichol art. So I guess I did the easy bit, which was suggesting to Chile that, you know, there might be kind of very interesting work that nobody had seen in Mexico and the southwest United States coming out of these traditions. And then Chile did the hard bit, which was two amazing epic ordeals and adventures. One in New Mexico and sort of Native American country in the southwest, and then the other just recently to Old Mexico, as they call it there.
To Old Mexico. But I want to pick up on that thing which you just touched on there, which is that when the West first comes across this, well, of course, you have the conquistadors, you have the Spanish arriving on the eastern seaboard and moving across the country, and they're moving so quickly. And they were pushing some peoples before them. Some peoples were just conquered and held in those places. The Huichol did something very interesting. They were living in their ancestral area, which is a desert area, in what's called today Wirikuta. And as they felt this pressure, they moved away from it. They moved towards the hills, basically, up into the hills. And in those hills, when you see pictures of them, John and Julie's got some stunning pictures of the Sierra Madre Occidental, big green mountains, fast-flowing rivers, cliffs. You don't go through those things easily. And they moved up and they found themselves a haven. It's that things that you all want when civilization is getting too close to you. You want to retreat, you want to retire. And they survived there. They're an extremely self-sufficient lot. But the place they left was something that they had an ancestral memory of. And the one thing that they didn't have up in the Sierra Madre, up in the mountains, they didn't have the peyote cactus, which was part of their tradition. So they would have these pilgrimages once a year. They would go down, they would travel down. It's about 35, 40 days journey on foot back to the ancestral desert. And they were looking for this cactus. The cactus was part of their ceremonial way of interacting with the gods. They would bring it back with them. But they established this kind of map. There's a kind of cosmology. The Huichol world, if you look at the simplest of the Huichol artwork, yarn paintings, there are always these 5 elements. And these are, in essence, these are the 4 corners of the world that sit on pillars. And in the centre, you have the highest pillar that holds the heavens up. So you have a 5-cornered thing. The way this map now gets translated and passed on is that this is where the Huichol live today. This is the centre, this is Teafat. And over in the west is the old Wirikuta. And over on the east side, you have the western seaboard, you have the sea. And there are these 4 sacred sites. So they go on pilgrimages to these sacred sites. But the important one is the Wirikuta, the land of flowers. They're going back there to find the sacred flower, the peyote, which they'll collect, which they'll hunt ritually, links to the deer there, and they bring it back. This is the core of, if you like, of their ritual. So pilgrimage is important. This mind map, this map that can be mapped back onto reality is important. But I wanted to talk about this pressure of civilization moving in. The Christians arrived, the Spanish arrived, and they wanted to Christianize. They wanted they were proselytizing. They knew that Christ would save everybody, and they wanted to save the Mexicans. They wanted to save the people that they met. They wanted to save the indigenous. They wanted to save the Huichol. The Huichol didn't really need to be saved, thank you. So they disappeared up into the mountains. 2 things I wanted to say a little bit about is about this the way, because you mentioned the Inquisition, and people just think Inquisition. No, this was serious stuff. If you were caught with, well, it's a bit like being caught by the police down, with LSD or cocaine or something in your pocket. You didn't want the Christians to know that you had peyote. So the devil's root was was the Christian term for it. Tell us a bit about that interaction between the priests, because I think the ritual was they didn't get the Jesuits, the hardcore Jesuits were given to other tribes, and they got the Franciscans, didn't they?
Mm-hmm.
The Franciscans are a different group, but tell us a little bit about this interaction between Christianity and peyote.
Yes, it's very strange. You can get a sense of just how strange it must have been for the Spanish and particularly the Jesuits to arrive in this country, which of course they thought was China or India or something. They had no idea of where they were, in global terms. And to encounter people with all these extraordinary plants and medicines, some of which they already knew about, like tobacco, from Christopher Columbus. But this turned out to be part of a huge pharmacopoeia of mind-altering plants of different kinds, including some very strange things, unlike anything they'd ever seen before, like the magic mushrooms and particularly the peyote cactus. And they saw peyote being used in two ways, really. One of which was by a sort of shaman or doctor or sort of traditional healer who would take it, in a one-to-one consultation with people, sometimes for physical healing, but often just for seeing things that are normally invisible, like seeing the hidden causes of illness, seeing, if somebody was having a run of bad luck, what was going on there, if somebody had lost or had some object stolen, where might it be, those kinds of consultations. But there was also, particularly up in the north and towards the, out of the Nahua or Aztec area, up in the tribal area where the Huichol lived, they would also come across these ceremonies which were much more collective ceremonies around peyote, usually around fires, usually at night when a whole community, often a whole village, would gather. And this was a very strange sight for the Jesuits, just because it looked so like the Catholic Mass. You would have a priest figure, a maricame or a shaman, who would have the peyote, and they would hand it out, to the celebrants once at a time. It would be received with downcast eyes, with muttered prayers. Kapal would be burning, incense, very like the frankincense in the Catholic Mass. So. And these were all people, all these Spanish had come from Europe in the height of the witch craze, so that the devil was everywhere. So what was going on here? Was this was it that the people here had become kind of ensnared by the devil's wiles? Did they think that they were performing the Mass, or was the devil mocking them by making them sort of perform a parody of the Mass? So the way that this emerged, the early Jesuits wanted the local people to convert to Christianity. They wanted to save their souls. That was the ostensible mission. Of course, the mission was about the gold, but it was, the mission, as the Spanish narrated to themselves, was about saving the souls of these savages. What was to be done with this? So the idea that emerged was that it was actually the devil that was playing a trick on them by convincing them that these visions they were getting from the peyote were the visions from the gods when they weren't. So in this way you could see you weren't blaming the savages, you were saying the poor savages, they don't understand that they're being fooled by the devil. So what we need to do is to teach them confession, to make them understand, have an account of themselves and their own personality and their own responsibility, so that we can, so there are all these catechisms emerged which are saying, do you go to sacred places in the rocks and leave flowers? Do you take peyote? It's about breaking all these habits. So then obviously what happened was that there's the great stuff from Jesuits saying trying to get the locals to stop taking these plants is the hardest part of their indoctrination, because they would just nod and smile to the priests and then secretly go off and carry on taking their peyote in the way that they always had done. They would kind of Christianize it often, but because Christianity had magical power, so sometimes you'd kind of incorporate it with the Virgin Mary or the saints, and you'd get people baptizing their babies with a sort of a little cross of peyote juice on their foreheads and so on. And the particular worry actually for the Spanish was not so much the savages, it was that the sort of backsliding of Spanish and mestizo people, that peyote started to become popular with non-tribal people, for magic or for healing. So it was all about drawing a line, I think, between, the savage and the uncivilized on the one hand, and the civilized and the Christian on the other. And peyote became kind of that line. If you were someone who took peyote, you were kind of a savage, you were sort of riffraff, If you had to stop taking peyote to become, a sort of Christian, civilized person who was part of the civilization that was coming. So I think that's the way that's what's so fascinating about, the sort of cultural aspects of peyote, is that you can see the way that it's used sort of to winnow out, to separate out the unreconstructed savages from the people who are modernising. And that's the same in the late 19th century on the Indian reservations as well. The missionaries and the federal authorities, are all about stamping out the peyote church when it starts, because, we've got to get this superstitious nonsense out of the way before we can make these people into proper Americans.
Proper American Christians. Well, that's exactly what I wanted to go next. Because the story that Mike tells is, well, it's an expansive history, but it becomes fascinating because of the fact that you have this Mexican story, the huichol, the peyote in Mexico, and the fact that then it gets taken up later by the Plains Indians. Now, it's a completely different historical situation, although, and this is what's fascinating, it's the same thing. Because so we've had the Spanish coming into South America, and then you have, of course, the white expansion from the eastern seaboard across, and you're driving the Indians back, the Comanche, the Kiowa, the Cheyenne, all these people, they're being driven back into, once again, they're looking for high places, but the Plains Indians didn't have any high places to go to. Big Indian wars. Now you're talking the late 19th century America. And tell us first, because this is the really fascinating thing, is the link that takes the peyote up. As you say, it's in Texas to some extent, but how it gets to Oklahoma and places like that, what's happening there?
Yeah, well, this is fascinating, I think, because peyote only grows in the northern deserts of Mexico and a little bit in what's now Texas, around sort of Laredo. So the number of North American tribes who'd encountered it was very small. There were Apache bands like the Mescalero and the Lipan who spent time there and knew something about it. But it starts to move up to Oklahoma, where you have, as you say, the reservation where it really kicks off is in the southwest Oklahoma, which is the Comanche and the Kiowa and the Apache. And these are, the fiercest, the most savage tribes in terms of American government policy. These are the really wild ones, the last ones to come in from the wild. And Quanah Parker, the chief of the Comanches, had been the last to come in, and he'd found this canyon up at Palo Duro. They'd hidden out up in the high canyon country, very like the Huichol Canyon country, until the Texas Ranger general just came in and just massacred 1,000 of their horses and sort of just wiped them out. So, however, there are so many different stories about how the peyote got there and how it started. But then when you encounter the Plains peyote ceremony, what will become the Native American church, it's quite different from the Mexican ceremony in various ways. Firstly, particularly after the ghost dance in 1890, the federal authorities, the American government, get very paranoid about any singing and dancing on reservations, and traditional ceremonies are all banned, the sun dance is banned. So the peyote ceremony starts off as a clandestine ceremony, and that's why it takes place in a teepee and it takes place at night, because it's something that has to be hidden, like the early Christian church maybe, or something like that. It's something that has also kind of grown up in the context of the reservation, where you have Presbyterian and Protestant kind of missions, you have prayer meetings and Sunday services, and it's kind of, in a way, a little bit more like that. The Huichol ceremonies, you have Marikames, shaman, sort of caste who cultivate their spiritual power. The Native American Plains ceremony, when it starts, is very, very much not like that. If there's someone who runs the ceremony called a roadman, but they're really just a facilitator, and they're very, very careful, the roadman, to say that, I'm not a person with special powers. So every ceremony still to this day starts with the rattle and the drum and all the sacred objects being passed around, so everybody can touch them, everybody can get their power off them. It's all about the, every individual person is their own conscience and their own priest. And you can take this religion in your own way. It's not so much a tribal ceremony on everybody's, on the part of everybody, like it is in Mexico. It's more a path that individual people have, supporting each other, to find their own truth, to find their own path, to find their own life. So, looking at it from a bigger perspective, it's actually taken on some of that Protestant culture around it. And from the very beginning, the people who were advocating for the peyote ceremony, were very keen to say, this is not a rival to the church, this is a distinctively Indian form of a similar thing.
So you got the same kind of thing. You have a defeated people. I think it's worth saying that the American idea was, we need to get rid of the Indians. And the way you get rid of them is you civilize them, you Christianize them. Basically, within a generation, they wanted to breed the Indian out.
And kill their food source.
There are all kinds of ways of doing it.
Yeah.
Just talk.
And then taking their children off to schools where they were punished every time they tried to speak their own language, and they were forced to speak English. There was a whole world of colleges, and this was all about, it was. And if you read it, a lot of the people who are proposing this, are doing it in progressive, liberal language. We don't want to, keep these Indian people sort of away from our sort of the benefits of our civilization in their ghettos. We want them to be part of America. We want them to have the benefits that we have of education, of healthcare. This is the language. But the practice is that it's a forced assimilation, and the peyote religion from the very, very beginning was about keeping Native American culture alive in this new world surrounded by a hostile white majority. How can we make a space where the old medicine still works?
Well, the devil's root, as you know, the peyote itself, is a very shy cactus. It's not like the San Pedro, which is huge and you can't miss it. The peyote is really difficult to find. It's covered, you might think it's covered with stones or something. And when you get inside and look at it, it's got this very, very, very long, deep root. It's going looking for water deep down. It grows very, very slowly. And I've always thought that there's a sense in which it was somehow correct that the thing that kept the taproot of these old cultures alive was this very quiet hidden root.
They say the peyote is the smallest plant in the desert, and you have to make yourself as small and as humble as the peyote before it will teach you anything. So that idea is kind of very much built into the plains ceremony, that you have to lose your ego, you have to become small and humble. And I think this just must have been extraordinarily powerful in that first generation, where you had a group of particularly young men who were raised as warriors. That was their life, and now suddenly they were on the reservation, being sort of starved, and lost their buffalo, subsisting on government rations, and it was an incredibly difficult situation for them to deal with. And I think the teepee and the peyote ceremony became a place where these young men could be very humble, and often, still today in the ceremony, the tears often begin in a very sort of humble, pitiful manner, with the supplicant saying, I'm not worthy, I'm so pitiful, I'm so weak, and then they build to this amazing oratory. But it was all built on this idea that this has to be a space where we can confess our true feelings to each other.
And I think also another idea, you just mentioned it again, you touched it, which when we talk about these Plains Indian ceremonies, Plains Americans, that you didn't just have one tribe in the sense that you do with the Huicholes. If you're in a Huichol ceremony, you're all Huichol. You're speaking the single language, the young people might not speak it as well, but you're all Huichol. These reservations, you would be a mix of different tribes. You'd be Comanche, Kiowa, Apache. These were not tribes that necessarily got on together. They didn't speak the same language. They were using sign languages on the reservations, even to communicate with each other. So they come from completely different traditions. But what's fascinating is that the church, the peyote ceremony, gives them a common space.
Yeah.
That's very important.
This is part of the ethos, and still is. You should always have people from more than one tribe in a Native American church ceremony. And these were people who had never lived together, who'd kind of previously been hostile. That was one of the things that the ghost dance did, was to bring people together of all kinds of different tribes and made all kinds of different intertribal networks. And the peyote really kept that going. So once Quanah Parker, who was the chief of the Comanches, who became the kind of recognisable figurehead for the peyote religion in the early days, he then took it out to all these other tribes. The Ponca, the Osage, and the Oto, and the Cheyenne, all these other Oklahoma tribes. Oklahoma had been, in theory, Indian country. That's where everyone was moved to until the settlers started moving in, and the Settler Act, and then kind of all those treaties were broken and the land was taken away. So this was kind of the central melting pot for all these different Indian cultures, and the peyote religion was what radiated out of Oklahoma and eventually, all the way through America and Canada as it is today.
Yeah, so you just mentioned Quanah Parker, the chief of the Comanches. Mike writes very briefly in the book about this story, but I want to also talk about, you mentioned James Mooney, and this brings in the Irish. I know we have some Irish people in the audience. This brings in James Mooney, who's of Irish origin. Absolutely critical, I think, to this story, the way it's told. And what's fascinating is that Mooney himself realises that what happened to the Irish is exactly the same thing as he's seeing. He's seeing the American state doing to the indigenous peoples what the British had done in Ireland. There's no dancing, you can't wear the colour green, you can't, and it comes in as a heavy, you don't. It's a way of eradicating Irishness, getting rid of the Gaelic, making people speak English, and so on and so forth. So Mooney, who's American by now, he becomes this fascinating interface agent between, he's working for the government ultimately, I think. But he begins to become interested in the cultures that he's meeting. Take over, and himself and Parker have this have this fascinating exchange.
Yeah, and James Mooney was an ethnologist at the Smithsonian Institution. I mean, he'd been, as a young man, fascinated by Indian tribes and learnt all their languages and just kept applying, from his small town to the Smithsonian Institution until they took him on. So he was really kind of self-made and became a great expert, and was driven, as Jesse said, by just how clearly he could see the experience of the Irish under the British, being played out again. So when he gets out to Oklahoma, he discovers that the Kiowa, for example, have a sort of written language that nobody knew about. So they've got calendars of everything that's happened to them in the last decades. They've got heraldry and whole complicated systems that nobody's looked at. And Mooney and a few other sort of ethnologists from the Smithsonian, it's like, well, their job is just to gather up all these thousands of years of tradition, before they disappear. They're all disappearing before their very eyes. And none of the other ethnologists, apart from James Mooney, are very interested in the peyote religion, because they see it as something that's not authentic, something that just kind of, sprung up on the reservation just as an accident. They see it rather like, the alcohol that's a terrible problem on the reservations. It's regrettable that, the Indians have lost, all their old traditions, and they've started, taking peyote, which has nothing to do with them. It's a sort of old Mexican tradition. And James Mooney is the one who says, no, this is actually crucial. This is the form in which Indian culture is going to survive. Because inside the teepee, the peyote creates this kind of space, where the old ways still live, and this is going to keep the culture alive. And this is very much the same recognition that Quanah Parker has had, the chief of the Comanches, who becomes, a very dominant figure in the early days of the peyote religion. And he can see that. He never supported the ghost dance. He could see that, that was always going to end in tears. This idea that there was going to be some magical apocalypse that was going to wipe all the white people away. He was more focused on, getting Texan cattlemen to pay for grazing rights on his reservation so that all his people would have some money. He was very practically focused by this point. But he also had recognised that the peyote religion was what was going to keep them together as a culture. And he and James Mooney both independently evolved the same way of talking about it to white people. First of all, it's a medicine. It's a very important medicine, and Western medicine should be looking at it. And secondly, this is our equivalent of Christianity. This is not like alcohol. This is not something we just get drunk with this on a Saturday night. This is something that gives us direct experience, of our religious roots, within a culture that's very, sort of congenial to, what's happening in churches. So Quanah Parker's famous saying is that he always used to say to people is, well, the white man goes into his church and talks about Jesus, but the Indian goes into his teepee and talks to Jesus. This is our sacrament. It always has been. Jesus, well, it was your people who killed Jesus. It wasn't the Indians. That all that's part of your religion. That's all about you getting absolution for that act. That's not really part of our tradition. Our tradition, is that the way in which we, come into contact and stay into contact with God is through the peyote.
So I think one of the things that Mike is very careful to say in this is that none of these traditions really are that old in some sense. The peyote itself is to be very old. But for example, here we have on the walls, we have this wonderful representation of peyote culture. We have the beadwork and we have the yarn work. And it's not actually very old at all. I can't say that this is ancient traditional ritual art, because it's not. It probably dates from about the 1960s. Juan Negrin got down there. What's fascinating, other people like Juan Negrin, there are these fascinating, for me, interface agents. We just talked about James Mooney. People who were looking at this culture and seeing their own culture in it, seeing Irish history in the Native American problem, seeing these other things, seeing Christianity in the ritual sacrament, as it were. This is not that old as a way of putting art out. But what's fascinating really is that the art really grows out of the contact with white agents who were sympathetic towards the ritual people. So Mike was just saying something earlier, which is that a very interesting reflection is taking place here between them producing art, in a sense, for us. And we who want to be supportive of their current situation, the loss of their culture and so on, we learn about these things and we reflect back to them. But this art itself is changing very, very quickly. The art that we produced and showed 20 years ago is already of a different kind, and the art that was 20 years before this is 1999. The art that Juan Negrin was showing, of this art here, we had one wonderful example in this show, which was the same artist, this artist here, Moto Aqua. This is a piece from 1980s, 1970s, 1980s. It was made for somebody who knew, John Lilly Jr., made for somebody who knew a lot about the Huichol culture. It's a very complex piece. And this is the same artist, this is the same artist. So, the art, in a sense, it's almost being produced for a Western market, but at the same time it's not. There's something that remains essentially the Huichol telling their stories, and if you are interested in them, you're interested in them. But I'm fascinated now, I want to begin to move it because we want to open it to you. I'm fascinated by this idea of syncretism, that the Plains Indians are taking the Huicholi ceremony and they're adapting it to their very particular needs of preserving their own culture in a very hostile environment. And the Huicholi are taking their ceremony up into the hills and they're maintaining it to keep their culture alive. The West, in a sense, is post-Jesuits, post-Franciscans, has lost most of its ideas about the meaning of life and the sacred and the links to the heavens and so on. They've lost them. There's a sense in which today we are going out looking for these things. And I find the Huichol in particular a very interesting group because, and also the Native Americans, because there's an ecumenical aspect to them. There's the thing that we showed very early on, I'll talk about it in a moment. But first, your ideas on this amazing syncretism that is actually, they're much more comfortable with it than we are.
Yeah, I mean, I hadn't looked into this in much detail before. I knew Huichol art, and like most people, probably the first thing I thought when I looked at it was, wow, that's so psychedelic and so dazzling, and you know, that really reminds me of kind of peyote and mescaline. There's something about the colours that are so solar and radiant, and you know, these opposite colours setting up these oppositions. There's this beautiful picture you showed in here with peyote, Alejandra's one, with sort of peyotes that are so intricately drawn that they kind of seem to pinwheel like an optical illusion when you look at them. And you know, it was a while before.
This is what he's talking about.
Yeah.
This is one that we showed in that 99 show.
And it was a while before I went and looked at what Huichol art looked like before, and the first person to really collect it was an anthropologist called Robert Zing in the 1930s who spent time there. And he was, you know, as Jesse said, you know, he was fascinated by seeing something that we'd lost. He said this is a whole different idea of art. You know, our idea of art in the West is very, you know, individual, and we're always trying to do something new and get our agent to sell it for more money than the next person's. You know, art is completely different in Huichol culture. Art is something that everybody does, just like everybody's sort of a shaman, everybody's an artist. You know, this work is votive work. It's produced just for the temple ceremonies, or it's to be left out at sacred spots in the desert. Nobody signs their name to a piece of art. This is all art produced by everybody for the temple ceremony. And the art that he produced was before, you know, these kind of synthetic threads and aniline dyes. So the colours are much more muted, it's much more sort of earth tones, kind of greens and browns and reds. It's absolutely beautiful, you know, and it's, you know, absolutely authentic sacred art. You know, but it doesn't kind of pop to us in this way, you know, so it made me kind of aware that various things had gone on between then and now. I think it was a folk art dealer, maybe in Zacatecas, who first of all said, why don't you mount these on plywood, because that would make them very portable and kind of easy to move around. You know, there were you know, anthropologists like Peter Forst who kind of sat down with people and said, you know, draw me your stories. You know, and before that, yarn paintings had only had kind of one image in, and after that you started to get, you know, these whole elaborate stories told. So this has been a co-evolution between, you know, the Huichol and the rest of us, and they've produced something which is so fantastically pleasing to our eyes, and now completely distinctive. You know, it must be one of the most distinctive indigenous art styles in the world. The number of people who would look at that and go, oh, that's Huichol art, you know, and the peyote pilgrimage, you know, and the whole story comes with it, you know. So, you know, but I think from a Huichol perspective, you know, this line between what's authentic and produced for ceremony and, you know, what's produced for the market, that distinction isn't really there for them. It is for us. I think, this is them, it's their consciousness, it's their perspective on the world, just projected now so much more powerfully and effectively into the world than it was a century ago.
And there's also a sense in which the wheel really has come full circle, because in the way that they were moving away from Western civilization as the 400 years ago, as the conquerors came through, we're now beginning to see Huichol, first of all, obviously in Mexico City. There are large groups of urban Huichol who will go back sometimes to their places, but we're beginning to see the Huichol shamans travelling abroad. And if the centre of the Huichol culture is to do with a kind of a balance between the natural world and the human who lives in that world. Any one of these, probably one with this one at least, any one of these Huichol yarn paintings, you can see that they're talking about a cycle, and the main cycle they talk about is the water cycle. It's the water comes out of the sea and it's brought up by the clouds, and it comes over and the sun hits it and gets up to the mountains, and we need that rain. We need the rain at one time of the year to come down, because that's what makes our crops grow. The crops grow, the deer feed, the peyote grows, we feed on those. So that water cycle comes back to the rivers, flows back to the sea, and it comes back. They had this incredible understanding of the natural world, because they were surviving on these very tiny margins. If the rains didn't come for a while, you needed some ceremonies to make sure that the rains would come. The slaughtering of the deer's blood is going back, because it's a votive offering. You're asking the gods to bless the land. The wheels come full circle in the sense also that today they realise that the world is not in a particularly good place either. The Huichol shamans are now beginning to come out and are travelling, because they now see that the world is actually in a very, very bad place. And the film that Johnny has made, the Well Worth a Little Watch, this is not actually, as many people might think, a Huichol ceremony in Jalisco or Zacatecas or somewhere. This is in England.
Where?
This is
Where?
I wasn't going to say that. I was trying to be secretive about it. Okay, so
Western part.
I meant to say UK. I meant to say UK. Sorry. The Welsh nationalists jumped in. These were 5, and again you have the Huichol idea. There were 5 different pilgrimages made from a central point. Maybe the central point was Stonehenge or somewhere. They selected the ancient sites of England, and they do a kind of a series of 5 pilgrimages to 5 different sites. And the idea was to go and look at the ancient songs, the ancient stories, the ancient music of this place. Because this place is exhausted and the land is tired, and we've been taking stuff from the land here too. And they are, in a sense, producing their own sacred map, but then implanting it on there and putting it onto our world as well. So, syncretism in a sense coming full circle. This is a fascinating little film, which maybe one day we hope will.
And very different strategies between them. The Huichol have embraced this renovation of the world, millennial project. They're going all around the world. They have their tukis, their temples with their cardinal points, and there's a whole network and ceremonies that keep the world in balance. And their idea now is that the rest of the world is coming out of balance, that all the ceremonial work they've done, the rest of us haven't been doing it. So their project has become global, about projecting this message and projecting themselves. The Native American Church, I find, have much less of a window on the world. Their art is much less aimed at the wider art market. It's more about sort of other church members. They're always talking to each other. It's also very syncretic, particularly the Navajo, who are the largest tribe who've adopted the Native American Church, enormously over the last generation. And they, if you look at their go down to their flea markets and see what they're selling. You know, it's all, you know, this grab bags of imagery from all over the place, you know, from all sorts of different indigenous American cultures, all sorts of different parts of Native American culture, and it's a Western culture as well. It's, you know, it's very dynamic in the same way as this. It's kind of changing all the time. But but there's also a sense with the Native American population in the United States that it's not their mission to go out into the world. It's like, you know, the sort of white people came over and did their very best to wipe out, you know, Indian, Native American culture entirely, you know, and now white culture is in trouble and white people are coming to them going, you know, help us, you know, give us your great Indian wisdom, you know, tell us how to live, you know. And so I think the irony for that for them, you know, is sort of, you know, it means that the dynamic for them is very different. They're not kind of going out to the world and telling everybody that this is the way to live, you know, this is, you know, because I guess in a way it's the difference between the USA and Mexico and the difference between your situation there. You know, they're much more focused on keeping their culture going in their part of the world.
And then just one last thing on that. That's absolutely correct, I think, Mike. But the Huichol sacred land of flowers is now under even more serious threat. And you can see that it wasn't just the conquistadores coming in. The same idea, the Mexican government had this, the poor Huichols, they need some education, they need some hospitals, they need to be looked after properly. So they began to, the difficulty was getting in there. So they began to put in airstrips, and with the airstrips there was beginnings of communication. But as they were flying over the Huichol country, they realised that there were forests there. So in the very early part, as they were civilising the poor indigenous peoples, they spotted all this wood. And wood was of some interest to the trade at the time. So as they put in first airstrips and then roads, they were able to take the wood out. So they were cutting down the Huichol, the remaining wood. So they destroyed the Huichol forest. They were after the wood first. But today the place is almost completely given over to mining interests, and the Canadian mining industry has moved into the land of flowers. So the Huichol today can't even walk their own traditional pilgrimage paths because the land is now owned by the Mexican government, but it's been given to Canadian mining companies. So it's amazing that they are still thinking about coming out to help us, even as their own culture really does go into serious crisis situation. They're now trying to buy their own land back.
And this is where this artwork comes in, because
surely that's why one of the reasons they're reaching out is because they want us to help them save what's left.
Absolutely.
Yes, very much so, yeah.
So Claudia's just reminded me it's time to let other people have something to say.
So,
Mike, we will
take questions. I think.
Even in the Western world, even particularly in the Western world, with austerity and the Income Tax gap, rising poverty, there is more and more research, not just on the collective, but on the individual level, or an alternative universe of some sort. And the motivation needn't be religious. As Bertrand Russell so aptly put it in his Nobel Prize acceptance speech in 1950, when we in the West went into primitive societies, and he was talking particularly about those that did not have psychedelia of any sort, when we went with taking with us all the blessings from the gift of the gospel to apple pie, the thing that was most prized by the natives was the discovery of alcoholic beverages, because, he said, it gave them for the first time in their lives the brief illusion that it was better to be alive than dead.
Thank you, Bertrand. I think Mike's reply would probably be they didn't need the alcohol; they already had the peyote. Anybody else with a question?
Do you have any stories of the Jesuits taking peyote or other substances and then converting themselves, going the other way against their...
I've never found any record of any of the early Spanish conquistadors or Jesuits or natural philosophers actually taking peyote themselves. They have debates between themselves about what's going on. There are some already by that point who are a little sceptical of this sort of devil story and say, well, actually, maybe there's just some chemical in the cactus that affects people's brains. That voice is kind of there. But by and large, the idea is that, this is the work of the devil, so nobody participates in it. And it's fascinating because this is the time, what's all kinds of products and plants are going backwards and forwards at this point. Tobacco and sort of cocoa and chocolate, and some of these are being adopted in Europe. A lot of them are being prohibited. I think they're all prohibited at one point or another. Tobacco was prohibited, first of all in Spain, and then later on in Russia. I think cocoa, chocolate, actually only Jesuits were allowed it for a while. There was always this, all these things kind of started off as medicines, so people were interested in things like peyote because people, by this point, were already starting to make a lot of money out of tobacco. You could sell that medicinally. But so some things went through this medicinal process, like tobacco and chocolate and tea and coffee, which are all medicines, and then they became kind of general goods that everybody was interested in, kind of leisure items. But there was something about peyote and magic mushrooms that they were kind of too strange to incorporate. And the only model to pick up on that, on your point, was alcohol. So the Spanish had the idea that when Indians or indigenous Mexican people took peyote or mushrooms, this was the experience they were having was like being very, very drunk. It's like drinking a bottle of vodka or something. So when the Spanish saw this from a distance, all they saw was alcoholic intoxication. Whereas the way that indigenous people used alcohol was quite different. They would, if there was a bottle of alcohol and there were, you and a couple of friends, you would drink, but you would carry on drinking until you finished the bottle. It would be something that you'd have a lot of at one time. And so that looked to the Spanish as if, these savages just got drunk all the time. But in fact, there were all kinds of things that the Spanish did that Indians would never have done. Indians would never drink on their own, for example. They would never drink kind of in moderation. So it was really two different patterns of the use of alcohol. And
there were Christians who regarded it as the worship of the devil.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions?
Yeah. Mike, I wonder, you've spoken already much about the qualities of the mind when it has mescaline. Mm-hmm. Do you mind expanding on other qualities?
Yes, I guess you can. The peyote cactus contains lots of chemicals, of which mescaline is one. It's an alkaloid. It's got about 50 other alkaloids in. So you can, if you look, in a pharmaceutical encyclopedia or just, on Wikipedia, you'll tend to get, under descriptions of mescaline, you'll tend to say, well, it produces visual hallucinations and other sort of oral hallucinations and, distortion of time and other effects usually compared to other psychedelics like LSD or magic mushrooms. There are also physical effects. Mescaline is a slightly different type of chemical from those other psychedelics. You have to take it at larger doses because it doesn't cross the blood-brain barrier so effectively. So you get more kind of physiological effects. It can kind of steamroll you, be sort of physically quite overwhelming in ways that might be very pleasant and euphoric or might be kind of rather nauseous and unpleasant. So, I think these kind of descriptions of what mescaline, does, in inverted commas, are helpful as far as they go, but they don't really tell you anything much about the experience itself. And they certainly don't tell you what the experience means. And that's what's so fascinating about following this history, is that there are all these different cultures in which it's been used sort of traditionally and ceremonially. And then when it arrived in Western culture, it was first of all of great interest to scientists studying the mind, then of great interest to chemists trying to work out what was in it, then of great interest to artists to see, how they could depict the way it made them see the world, and, then of doctors trying to make a medicine out of it. So I think it's, you can get, to a certain point by talking about, its effects on the mind, but I think beyond that, what you really get from looking at its whole history is all the different ways in which it's been used and how different the experience is, depending on whether you're taking it experimentally on your own, for example, or, in a cultural ceremony as part of a collective.
Greg, do you have a talk?
Thank you, first of all. Thank you for a fascinating talk. And apologies, my question is going to take it a little bit to the dark side. Any comments on the use of mescaline in the concentration camps, and then the American use of these people that gave it to them, giving them safe haven in America after the war?
Yeah, it was, as you probably know, during the 1920s and the 1930s, people started to get interested in, military intelligence people, America and Britain and Germany all started to get interested in whether you could use mind-altering drugs to control people's minds, or, as truth serums. And, during the course of that, pretty much every mind-altering drug was used at different times. Mescaline was often one of the first ones to be used because it was had been well established and known about. But everybody in different contexts gave up on it almost immediately because it was so unpredictable from their point of view. It had such different effects on different people. If you're looking for a drug that predictably makes somebody tell the truth, mescaline, you can try it on half a dozen different subjects and you'll get half a dozen different responses. So pretty quickly people moved on to things like, chloral hydrate and, those sort of... and sodium amytal, was kind of where it stabilised. But my favourite, from the German trials, which were turned up by the Americans after the war, the only comment on one of the mescaline trials was that it didn't seem to do anything predictably, and it was different for everybody and quite useless. The only thing that was predictable in every case was feelings of violent hatred and revenge towards the interrogator.
I think one of the other things that's interesting there again about this Western mind versus the indigenous mind is that when Parker finally gives Mooney a bag of peyote buttons, he takes it over to Washington, it very quickly becomes used by the intellectuals. They want to see what it does to them. It was all William James and so on. And then very quickly gets taken up by the scientists. They want to find out what's in it. They want to get into and that they do. They isolate it very, very quickly.
I think from the beginning it shows how hard it is for science to get to grips with what psychedelics do. Because pharmacists are used to a drug does a certain thing. If something is kind of, reduces your blood pressure, it reduces everybody's blood pressure. And even psychoactive drugs, Valium isn't like a stimulant for some people and a sedative for others. It does what it does predictably. But from the very first trials of peyote, somebody would have a wonderful experience, and then somebody else would have a nightmarish, paranoid experience. The third person wouldn't notice very much. The fourth person would get obsessed with some particular thing, and so for people who are trying to say, what does this drug do? Psychedelics, and peyote was the first one that science ever looked at, are extremely difficult to encompass because they seem to be working in a very different way from other drugs or on a different level.
Okay. I think it's just 100 years now, isn't it, since the first synthetic Mescaline was actually produced.
It is. That was 1919, 100 years ago. Was the first time. Before that, it was available as a sort of extract from the peyote cactus. But yeah, 100 years ago, it was in the University of Vienna that it was first synthesized in the lab from nothing. And I think that really changed the meaning of it, because before that, it was this slightly strange, magical substance that had come from this remote part of the world and from this strange cactus. But then it's amazing, as soon as mescaline sulfate is synthesized in the lab, it's just a white powder like any other. It's a product of Western science now. All that kind of, indigenous story gets forgotten.
I'm going to get, and then with the, when she was in Mexico, she sent us back this wonderful picture, which was scribbling on a wall that said, from the people of Oaxaca to the people of Mapuche, Vinceremos, which is the Huicholes from the top of South America to the indigenous peoples at the bottom of South America. We're all together, we're in this one together, and we will win. So I want to quote a Mapuche sage that Chile knows, who always says that his grandfather used to tell him, the white man, el hombre blanco, he used to say, the wonderful thing about the white man is he knows everything about everything, except for happiness. And I always think that that's Mapuche wisdom for you. So wonderful to have not only the Huichol wisdom, the Plains Indian wisdom, but really wonderful to have Mike talking about this itself is its own little pilgrimage, well worth taking 5 days in different directions, because it covers so much time and it covers history and art and so on. So it's a really wonderful book. I recommend it. But thanks very much for coming today to talk to us about everything.
Oh, thank you, Jesse. Thank you all.